When we describe taxonomic groups, we also use this system of nomenclature. It starts broadly and it goes to more specific groups. So the example that you've probably learned over and over throughout your schooling is domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and subspecies. And those are groups that go from broad to more specific. So if we're using ourselves as an example, we're in the domain Eukarya, we're in the kingdom Animalia, because we're not plants or fungi, we're in the phylum Chordata, that is, we're chordates, and within the chordates, we're in the class Mammalia, so we're mammals. Within Mammalia, we are primates, but there's a lot of primates, remember. But within the primate family, we are hominids, and the group hominids has a lot of different species, most of which are extinct. Our family is Hominidae, which includes the great apes, orangutans, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and our genus, which is Homo. Our species is Sapiens, and our subspecies is Sapiens. So if you were to describe our genus, species, and subspecies to somebody very specifically, you'd say that we are Homo sapiens sapiens. Lastly, we'll look at another example to really hammer it home. And here what we're doing is we're cutting down species within these groups. We're cutting down organisms till we get to the most specific. So we'll start with domain on top. So the domain Eukaryota, it encompasses a lot of different organisms, from the dogs to the wolves, coyotes, all the way to the paramecium and trees and mushrooms and things like that. All of those are eukaryotes. But if you talk about Animalia, which is one level down, you're cutting out the trees, which are plantae, and the paramecium, which are protists. So you're getting more specific as you look at the kingdom. Well, if you look at the phylum Chordata, you're then cutting the group down even more. You're getting rid of the earthworms and the moths, the annelid worms, which are arthropods, and the moths are arthropods as well. So you're getting more and more specific. And as you go down, you'll see that we're removing more and more organisms from this group until finally, when you talk about a species, Canis lupus, you're talking very specifically about a small group of organisms with a limited diversity as you talk more specifically. And it's no coincidence that the word specific sounds a lot like species. Finally, you have the species Canis lupus, which encompasses the wolf, and the domesticated version of the wolf, which is the dog. The tree of life includes three main branches. On that previous tree, I said that we are eukaryotes. That makes us distinct from these other groups. And we'll look at those other groups now. So we're eukaryotes. There's also another branch called archaea, and then another branch of bacteria. And this really makes up the three main groups of living things on Earth: eukarya, archaea, and bacteria. In later chapters, we'll look at a timeline of life on Earth, and from that perspective, you'll see that archaea and bacteria really are dominant in life on Earth. But it's only later in the evolution of life on Earth that you have these macroorganisms, these bigger organisms, these multicellular organisms like us. But for a long time, our world was a bacteria and archaea dominated landscape. Bacteria are defined as mostly unicellular organisms that lack cell nuclei. Archaea are similar in that they are also unicellular and lack cell nuclei. They're a little different though, and we'll go into the differences later in other chapters, but they do make up about a quarter of the biomass on Earth. So this is by no means a small group. And lastly, the eukaryotes are the group of life that often steals the limelight from everything else because a lot of them are multicellular and they're very interesting. They contain a cell nuclei and they include both unicellular and multicellular organisms. Let's look at the eukaryotes in a little more detail here and kind of look at how we fit into the eukaryotic branch. So remember, we're going from more broad to more specific. We're going from the domains to kingdoms. And one branch of the eukaryotes are the protists, and those are unicellular. Those are kind of the Swiss Army knife organisms that have a bunch of organelles inside them, and they do everything in one cell. And we'll talk about those in later chapters. You can watch them under a microscope, and they're all around, and they really are little Swiss Army knife organisms. The next branch is plantae, and those are the plants. Those are also eukaryotes. And another branch is the fungi, and you can see here that we're actually more related to fungi than we are to plants. And lastly, we have Animalia. All these groups we're looking at are extant. They all exist today. You can find archaea, bacteria, protists, plants, fungi, and animals. You can go on a walk and find them all. So this layout here isn't totally correct in the way I've laid it out, but what I'm trying to illustrate is all the different diversity that we might be familiar with here on the eukaryotic branch. Let's briefly look at the domain eukarya so you can have an idea of what organisms make that domain. So protists are multiple kingdoms, and they're mostly unicellular. Some are multicellular, some are colonial. Protists can be autotrophic and heterotrophic. So autotrophs would be generating energy from things like sunlight or chemical energy, and heterotrophs would be organisms that have to eat other organisms or matter in order to generate energy. Fungi are mostly multicellular, and those are heterotrophs, so they have to eat things in order to metabolize. So some fungi live in the soil, and they have a co-evolutionary relationship with plants to help them gather more nutrients from the soil. Some fungi are parasitic. Some of them can live on your skin and cause infection. Some fungi grow fruiting bodies like mushrooms, things you can eat. And fungi are a really incredible group of organisms that we don't always notice because a lot of times they're out of sight, but they do make up a large amount of biomass and diversity. Plantae make the plants, and most plants are multicellular. We'll discuss plants in detail in later chapters. Plants are autotrophs, so most plants generate their metabolic energy using sunlight. There's a few tiny exceptions like parasitic plants, and we might talk about that more later, but the overwhelming majority of plants are autotrophic and use their chloroplasts to turn light into energy. Lastly, there's Animalia, which is a multicellular group of organisms. They're heterotrophic, so they have to eat and ingest other things in order to metabolize, and it's a very diverse group. You can see here there's a cnidarian, deep sea things. It's hard for me to think of something more different than myself than these deep sea comb jellies and things like that. We'll look at Animalia in further detail later, and this is where we'll be looking at different tissues and organs and organ systems. We'll spend a lot of that time within Animalia.